Yo, what it div, y'all? Let's get right into it. Let's talk about ballistas, right? Sub-archetype totems. Sub-archetype totems is probably the most accurate way to state it, just in the sense that it's one type of totem, right? There are spell totems, there are melee totems, there are ballista totems. Ballista totems, in case you guys didn't know, by the way, are usable with both bow and wand. I actually utilized this on my league starting this league on the LA Hit Champion. The LA Hit Wand Champion, right? Like that was a part of my single target, was the realization like, oh yeah, you can ballista a wand skill. So it's actually just generally ranged attack totem, right? And so these totems, funnily enough, actually replaced the range attack totem support. And it did it in a way that allowed us to create a full archetype around it because it became unified with the existing ballista gems in the game. Talking about shrapnel, siege, and artillery ballista. And when you combine with those three, all of the other options for putting on a ballista, you have a very well-rounded archetype to talk about and why it's been relevant for so long in a very low-key type of way. With the exception of like EA ballistas in recent memory, ballistas have not made a ton of noise, especially after being crowded out of the elemental bow leveling space by Manaforge era setups, as well as just generally things like TR falling out of favor, and some very interesting sleeper builds that no one really talks about. I'm going to accidentally blow the lid off of one of those in this video. I apologize to the people who enjoyed that build. But, before we get into all of the details here, if you like these type of videos, like the video, let me know you want to see more of it. And if you want to see more of what I do on the channel, subscribe, maybe even click that notification bell to know when I'm posting more, right? Now, let's get into it. So, let's talk ballistas at base, right? I'm going to shortcut my math a little bit here based off of the fact that I really did a really extensive deep dive on the spells. And I did it for spells, actually, because I wanted to talk specifically about how they are underperforming. Or spell totems are underperforming. And unlike spell totems, I do not have the same feelings towards attack totems. And, well, specifically ballistas. Melee totems, a different discussion. But we're talking about ballistas, there's a couple of things that stand out to me as very strong strengths of the archetype that really overshadow the fact that I think that the archetype could use more damage. One of them is actually just the innate strength of bows at the moment. If you saw my old video about bows, or if you're just at all privy to the state of the meta in this game at the moment, you're very aware that bows are extremely strong. Ever since the buff in 3.19 that gave bows access to two-handed melee levels of elemental rolls on the bow, we have really seen a meteoric rise in the strength of things that use bows, and ballistas, by no surprise, are a part of this. Technically speaking, like wand ballistas are also pretty good, but like I'm just keeping it a buck, we're going to talk about bow ballistas for the majority of this video because they are just better at the moment. Like it is just noticeably better. And so your base type weapons got a lot of damage and a buff, right? That's a really good thing. The gems themselves are actually all pretty strong in their own ways. And the thing that really sets ballistas apart for me across all of the archetypes is that, one, ballistas have a faster summoning speed than spell totems. This is very important because you're not looking to, you're not building around having to summon them so fast because they just kind of come out quicker than normal, and that's a really good thing. Two, on this same vein, is that you also get more max totems by them existing. You don't have the problem with spell totems where you simply only get one totem, no matter any source of your spell totem, by the way, at the start, whether that be through the support or shockwave totem. Whereas when you play with ballista totem support, you get +2. And if you play with any other of the actual skills, so siege, shrapnel, or artillery ballista, they actually scale upwards to, I believe, +4 ballistas at level 21, right? 2, then 3, then 4 additional ballistas. So if you're playing, just say you're playing artillery ballista, for example, you're naturally going to get to 4 total ballistas in maps, and then 5 when you get your level 21 artillery ballista gem. And that's a lot different than playing a spell totem build because you don't actually get that same benefit. So these are the two things that really make the archetype stand out to me in terms of it at base. The things that made ballistas worth investigating because, toot my own horn real quick, I've been investigating ballistas for a long ass time. Back when bows were truly in the drought, I would say, in the Conquerors of the Atlas era. So 3.9 to 3.12, when bows had just been guttered after their meteoric run and their generational run in 3.8, they got massively guttered in 3.9. and everybody thought they were never going to really recover. But when they did the Ballista rework, I started to look into it for runs of my own to Cirrus. This was back when Cirrus was the end game, and so I would see about my A5 runs, like doing bow runs with ballistas on them. And I realized very quickly that the ballistas back then were really, really good. They were just better single target than most bow skills outside of specifically, barrage support and using the barrage skill gem. But it also allowed me to still use my main skill, because something else that's worth noting is that most builds that use Ballista Totems do not take Ancestral Bond. Most, not all, just most of them, because they tend to actually be on the right side of the tree, as that's where all of the other supportive scaling for the build tends to come from. Again, not every, but a lot of them. The right side of the tree does not allow you access to Ancestral Bond easily without some really fucked up pathing. So you aren't actually denied your own damage. And so you're allowed to do Ballista damage and you damage. And that makes a really strong combination, provided you actually have the sockets to spare for this idea. Right? It's a very, very strong way to play the game. And I found that was very good. Now, in this vein, I have to talk about one more piece to this puzzle that is very fascinating and very worth investigating, quite frankly, which is the existence of Focus Ballista support. Which I will say just now, I am a hater of this support, just flat out. I do not like the Focus Ballista support. It's not that I think it's a bad support. I think that when it came out, it was very much misused at first, and I think that's an important thing to stand on, which is everybody looked at the numbers it provided and said, holy shit, this support is insane. And at a surface level, I agree with this statement. Over time now, we've all come to realize it's not that simple, though. We've all realized, yes, Focus Ballista does come with a massive downside. So, for those of you who aren't aware, it's going to be on the screen, but it was already on the screen probably, but Focus Ballista does % more attack speed and % more damage as a support. It's a purely positive support for Focus Ballistas in numbers, but the downside is the behavioral change. Totems, all of them, innately attack regardless of what you do. You can be running, they are trying to attack. You could be attacking, they are trying to attack. Now, using Focus Ballista on your Ballista makes it so that the Ballista only shoots when you shoot. So if you're not shooting, the Ballista's not shooting, which means you are now trading out the quality of life from the Ballista playstyle for more damage. And you need to have a really good use case for this. Otherwise, I find this support to be really bad. Now, I did mention, though, that I'm a full-time hitter, but I noticed its strength because I think the actual numbers of it are weak, but for regular use. But where this really gets insane at is stuff like Storm Rain, stuff like, Storm Rain and Toxic Rain. Those two skills really stand it out as reasons to run Focus Ballista support if you were looking to do something ridiculous with boss deletion. There's a clip from when Focus Ballista actually got added to the game, and then Storm Rain got added. So Focus Ballista was in the game, first, if I remember correctly, and then Storm Rain was added to the game, and somebody applied it to an accuracy stack jug in standard and proceeded to kill Cirrus in the frame he spawned, basically. Because Focus Ballista allows you to cross the totem to attack even if there's nothing there. So you can pre-stack these skills that require incredible amounts of pre-stacking to get insane damage. Again, TR, Storm Rain, and it was beautiful. And so this support enables another interesting type of totem gameplay that I felt like was worth acknowledging. Other things that generally make this archetype strong, especially again talking about bow variants, is that, if you're playing bows, you also still have access to mana forged arrows for all of the other utility that brings you, just like if you were playing a regular bow character, right? And now you're just, instead of using mana forged for primarily your damage sources, you are using mana forged as purely utility for the most part. Frenzy with Call and Power Charge on crit, for example, or maybe Ensnaring Arrow for something more interesting and more niche, right? All of the above there. These are all of the various strengths of the Ballista archetype because it has a lot of them. It is a very strong archetype, and we're going to get into the last of those strengths in a bit. But we need to talk about this downside real quick because it's been lingering on my brain. And it sits on my heart heavy, really, that I hadn't talked about it yet. And it's just specifically the fact that ballistas die. A lot. Oh my God, do they die? It is horrific how much they die. Genuinely. There are defensive stats that exist for them on the tree and whatnot, just like there is for totems. In fact, they're generally generic defensive totem nodes, but it does not feel like it does shit. I'm just gonna keep it a buck with you. I don't feel like ballistas have a good lifespan. They die to essences, they die to moderately cooked rares, they die to damn near every boss in the game. They die to, like, it's so rare that I actually see a ballista like live its life expectancy when used on the right side of the tree. I've seen some ballista stuff on like Hyros and whatnot that actually do like live, but on the right side of the tree, now that bitch is dead as fuck when you start hitting things. It's so bad, dude. Like they are so squishy. And so if you plan on leaning into ballistas, you will need to prepare to make a little bit of sacrifice in your build to actually keep them alive, because otherwise you're going to lose a good portion of the benefits to summoning them. And I make this note really important in this video because I actually technically slighted this detail a little bit when talking about the spell totems, thanks to the reminders in the comments, especially from Toddy, who was like, yo, really emphasize the unfairness of T17s. That was his point. He was saying that T17s really hurt totem viability, and he's 100% right about that statement. T17s completely annihilate totems. You think the tuning on that is brutal for us? Go place a ballista or a spell totem in there and see what happens to that totem. It barely gets to do anything. And so as a result of that ridiculous tuning, this is like a really big downside on the archetype, because, you know, they die, your damage is dead. So you have to be wary of that, for lack of better wording, right? But again, like, that's like the only real downside that I feel when I talk about ballista totems. That, you know, of course I could talk in detail about some of the potential numerical problems, but the reality is that because of their positioning in the game, really, and this is something that I've always wanted to explore with spell totems as well, just as a side note, is that the positioning of ballista totems puts them in a position where it is extremely commonplace to use a totem as supplementary damage for a main skill setup. And it's always been interesting to me that spells don't actually do this. This is with a couple exceptions, obviously, right? Like, you still end up with your, like, EA ballistas are pure ballista characters, where the ballistas do all the damage and you, the player, only really use like frenzy to stack up your charges and whatnot, right? Like, there's obviously still pure ballista damage setups, but ballistas have so much more commonplace use as auxiliary damage or supplemental damage, as opposed to simply 95% of your output, which I find fascinating and I think is worth exploring in the spell totem space as well. And it's actually the main reason that I'm so positive on ballistas compared to spell totems. It's not because one is bad and one is good. Numerically, they're both roughly in the same place as solo damage archetypes, but you never see spell totems in that same light as a ballista totem. And I heavily believe that it has to do with the additional totems that ballistas get by existing. I think if spell totems had that, they'd actually probably be better in the same role. Now, let's talk about some stuff real quick before we get out of here with, like, quote, underground tech for ballistas. And I'm using the fattest of air quotes when I talk about underground tech, because they are not. They are not underground tech at all. It's just things that you haven't thought about in a while. So I'm going to put one of them very, very forefront of your mind and a second one like pretty close to your mind, right? If you haven't looked at Iron Commander in recent memory, I strongly urge you to read that damn weapon. Iron Commander is an insane bow, and the ballistas it modifies are so strong. Like, you will have, I don't want to say the easiest build of your life ever playing with Iron Commander, but just know this thing is insane. It scales so fucking well. It maps well. It does bosses incredibly well. It's generally extremely cheap because deck stacking is a less sought after archetype due to the lack of strong defensive scaling through the archetype comparatively to int and strength stacking. Like, it is a very, very strong archetype, and I would like urge you, if you want a funny, strong, cheap build, to really look into this archetype of totem build. The other one that I find very amusing and worth talking about is things in the Flamewood and Torch Orc Step variety. So flame wood works really well with ballistas because of the sheer amount of them that you get comparatively to a spell totem. You actually just have more ballistas than spell totems. So that's one thing that I feel like is worth noting. The other thing that I think is entirely worth noting for toe trick stuff is that I did see a really funny setup of like reverse knockback and using the reflected life damage to absolutely shred bosses. It was actually really incredible the damage it pulls out because you can like actually scale their life high enough that it matters. Not high enough to keep them alive, by the way, but high enough that they can do some ridiculous damage in a reflected setup because of the sheer hit count of certain bow skills. There's some really cool things you can do with bows alongside just the like really strong scaling that this bow ballista like archetype really has to offer. So I wanted to point some of that out, and that kind of wraps it all up for me, right? It's just that was just the topic we're talking about. I got to do totems a little bit more justice because I feel like the spell totem video was a bit more negative about them as a whole, when the reality is that spell totems, much like Ballista Totems, are fairly strong. They just suffer at the moment in the T17 meta where death of your totems is such a frequent occurrence. I am so sorry about the eyes, guys. I have something in my eye that's been really bothering me this entire time. Anyways, thank you guys for watching. As per usual, by the way, you want to see more of me, I do have a Discord, I do have a Twitch. They're linked in the description down below. Like the video if this really, taught you something, or you just want to see more of it. Subscribe to the channel if you really want to see more with that notification bell on. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.